Hello and welcome to the second of Aaron Copland School of Music's events for Women's History Month. It is my pleasure to welcome you all here. We're going to hear about Florence Price and we actually heard some Florence Price last night as well. Charisse Roberts sung a really spectacular rendition of Sympathy, accompanied by Leslie DeCastro and Matthew Kowalski. If you didn't see that, I'm pretty sure the link is still there somewhere. But for now, it is my really great pleasure to introduce Dr. Samatha Ege. She is the Lord Crewe Junior Research Fellow in Music at Lincoln College, University of Oxford. She holds the PhD in musicology from the University of York and a BA with honors in music from the University of Bristol. During her undergraduate degree, Dr. Ege studied abroad at McGill University in Canada, and she has also taught overseas, most recently at the United World College of Southeast Asia. Dr. Ege is a leading interpreter and scholar of the African-American composer Florence B. Price. Published and forthcoming work on Black women musicians by Dr. Ege appears in the Oxford Handbook of Public Music Theory, the Journal of American Music, Women in Music, a Journal of Gender and Culture, and the Kapralova Society Journal. Dr. Ege has given public talks and performances on 4 continents. In addition, she is co-editor and contributor to a forthcoming collection of essays on Price, and the composer features in Dr. Ege's current book project, which examines race, women, musical performance, and community creation in Chicago's South Side from the late 19th to the mid-20th centuries. Dr. Ege released her debut album, For Women, Music for Solo Piano by Florence Price, Vitislava Kapralova, Ethel Biddlesland, and Margaret Bonds in May of 2018 with Wave Theory Records. Her next album, Fantasie Nègre, the piano music of Florence Price, is, as I understand, imminent. Dr. Ege is a persuasive voice in the modern scholarly landscape. Her insistence on Price's singularity and talent as a composer and performer, alongside and within a community of like-minded African-American musicians and intellectuals, is an important corrective to pervasive assumptions that would see Price as an aberration, as a solitary and lonely exemplar of the Black classical tradition. It is my great pleasure to welcome Dr. Ege to the Aaron Copland School of Music. Thank you all for coming.
Thank you. Good afternoon, everyone. It's a real honor to join you in the celebration of Women's History Month. I would like to thank Professor Emily Wilborn for inviting me here. A lot of the research that you will hear about today would not have been possible if not for Professor Wilborn's advocacy and mentorship. So it's really wonderful to be here. I appreciate this opportunity for us to come together across different time zones and geographies. The one thing that I don't appreciate, though, is that my internet connection can be really intermittent. So I have pre-recorded today's presentation just to be on the safe side. But as the video plays, please feel free to type your questions and comments throughout, and we'll have some live Q&A at the end as well. So I think we're ready to begin. I hope you enjoy this lecture recital on Black classical Herstories and the piano music of Florence Price. Alicia Lola Jones' article about the Black sonic sisterhood of Florence Price and Marian Anderson begins poignantly with the question, when will we listen to Black women? Jones continues with the recognition that, quote, we are in an era of movements founded by Black women, such as hashtag Black Lives Matter, hashtag Me Too, and hashtag Say Her Name. And some of these even use messianic language to characterize those women as saving the day through their collective action. This recent surge in direct action represents a lineage of Black women lifting their voices for themselves that has its historical antecedent in demonstrations such as Marian Anderson elevating Florence Price's composition in her most notable recital at the Lincoln Memorial. End quote. This was a historic performance that took place in 1939. Anderson had been scheduled to perform at Constitution Hall in Washington, D.C. However, her anticipated performance was met with resistance from the Daughters of the American Revolution, who refused her entry on the grounds of her race. Anderson thus performed at the Lincoln Memorial in front of 75,000 people and a radio audience in the millions. She sang Price's arrangement of the spiritual, "My soul's been anchored in the Lord." She sang Price's music for the world to hear. When will we listen to Black women? When, I reiterate, and how? As a musicologist pianist who is driven by the goal to tell Black classical herstories beautifully, the how of this task is at the forefront of my endeavour. To tell Black classical herstories beautifully is to seek depth, to relish complexity, and often to unlearn some of the practices we have absorbed, particularly through our education, that have precluded us from learning to look and listen for these stories. For instance, I think of the assumption I grew up with that women didn't compose back then. I can't tell you when or how this phrase was passed on to me, but there was very little in my music education to suggest otherwise. Another more concrete instance was when a professor once told me that the kind of work I wanted to do, i.e. venturing beyond the canon, wouldn't be marketable. The present-day undervaluing of Black classical herstories continues the pattern of institutional neglect that historical Black women experienced in their time, hence the fragmented public record we are left with in their wake. To paraphrase Patricia Hill Collins, these scattered fragments on the one hand suggest the brilliance of countless extraordinary Black women, while on the other hand speak tellingly of the fate that befalls them. To tell Black classical herstories beautifully is therefore to also anticipate gaps in the narrative and to acknowledge periods of silence. Mia Bay asks, how do you write the history of a silence? And as musicians, how do we perform the history of a silence? This is when we must listen more closely than ever, because as Bay reflects, silences are rarely complete. And so whether what follows is the critical fabulation of Saidiya Hartman or a collectivist history of one's individual trajectory, in listening closely, we may enact a process of collaging the scattered fragments, bringing them into context and giving richly textured voice to a past we have yearned to hear. I would like to begin by taking you through an article I wrote called "Composing a Symphonist, Florence Price and the Hand of Black Women's Fellowship," which exemplifies a collectivist storytelling around Black classical herstories. And then I will close with my latest recording project, which is called Fantasie Nègre, the piano music of Florence Price, where I describe the project as my realization of a history that I have longed for and to which I now belong. In 1933, the Chicago Symphony Orchestra premiered Florence Price's Symphony No. 1 in E minor. History was made. Price became the first woman of African descent to make her symphonic debut with a major national orchestra. But how was this feat accomplished? Price's life as a composer was rich in experience and inspiration. From her early music education in her home of Little Rock, Arkansas, through her studies at the New England Conservatory, to her return to the South, and finally to her Midwest migration. However, a deeper investigation into Price's Chicago years reveals a career that was also rich in fellowship and support. Price's arrival coincided with the burgeoning transformations of a sweeping Black Renaissance. The Black Chicago Renaissance spanned approximately from 1930 to 1950. It rivaled the cultural contributions of Harlem, yet maintained its own distinctiveness as a result of the specific ways in which Black Chicagoans, both newly arrived and previously settled, engaged in geographically grounded, intellectually vitalized, and artistically inspired methods of self-actualization and collective uplift. The expressive arts were important vehicles, and artists provided some of the most essential forms of activism. Numerous women were involved. Their activism intersected with their roles as composers, writers, artists, school teachers, club women founders, and administrators of community institutions. This was the environment in which Price moved during her ascent to become the first nationally recognized Black female symphonist. But these realities alone barely acknowledge the artistic and intellectual milieu in which she worked. It gives no recognition to the Black women that comprised her community and also thrived in the classical realm. Price was not an anomaly in the American musical landscape. Behind the history that was made in 1933 lies an essential narrative, one that reveals how Black women's collective agency, advocacy, and activism paved the way for Price's success. We will explore three pivotal figures from Price's network: Nora Douglas Holt, Estella Conway Bonds, and Maud Roberts George. Like Price, Holt, Bonds, and George were not born in Chicago. Holt was from Kansas, Bonds was from New York, and George was from New Jersey. They are among a generational wave of women that moved to Chicago during the Great Migration, though only Price represents the predominant trajectory, from the rural South to the urban North. But upon their various arrivals, each woman made it their mission to foster networks and build communities. I begin this narrative with Holt's arrival in Chicago around the year 1916. Holt's activities prepared the community that became Price's own, laying the groundwork through three key institutions: the Chicago Defender, the National Association of Negro Musicians, and a network of homes. Bonds and George entwined their roles with Holt's across these institutions. Together, the three women epitomize the layers of interconnectivity that defined Price's network. Holt was the Chicago Defender's first female contributor and the first music critic to ever be employed by a Black newspaper. The Chicago Defender captured the zeitgeist of the Black Chicago Renaissance, and it sought to reflect all facets of African American life, from politics and activism to education and the arts. By the 1920s, the Chicago Defender had become one of the leading and most far-reaching publications of the wider African American community. Holt served as the music critic from 1917 to 1921. George inherited Holt's position and her News of the Music World columns when she became the Chicago Defender's main music critic in 1922. Holt was also the founder of the National Association of Negro Musicians, also known as NAM. She was the inaugural president of its first chapter, the Chicago Music Association, and in both instances, she subverted the gendered connotations of leadership. In Holt's wake, many more women, including Bonds, George, and Price, occupied leadership roles across NAM and its various branches. This, therefore, extended the site of Black women's activism to positions of greater institutional power. The home, as a gendered space historically ascribed to women, was the least public area in the site of Black women's activism. But in the case of Price's compositional journey, it was one of the most central. The Bonds family home is a prime instance of a space that provided more intimate community building, uplift, and empowerment. Price's time with the Bonds family is largely unveiled through the recollections of Bonds' Chicago-born daughter, Margaret. This is Margaret, and this is the Bonds to whom many, of the histories refer, especially since Price's and the younger Bond's activities often aligned and interlaced. But I am primarily concerned with Estella Bond's, and although her significance is undermined by a lack of thorough documentation, it may be that illuminating her importance here can create a space in which we can comprehend the unknown women whose acts and arenas elevated so many. So as we think about Price, the first African-American female symphonist of her stature, I refer to Shirley Graham Du Bois' question, how could she attempt it? How did Price become one of the most prominent symphonic composers of the early 20th century? The answer lies in her community and in the influence of the Black Chicago Renaissance women. In early September of 1918, Price returned to her home of Little Rock after an extended stay in Chicago with her maternal aunt, Olive Gulliver Lucas. Price's visit proved newsworthy as the Chicago Defender printed this in its All Around the Town feature. The significance of Price's stay for the Chicago Defender stemmed from the marital affiliations of both women. Thomas J. Price was a well-known Arkansas lawyer, as had been John Gray Lucas before relocating to Chicago and establishing his highly successful law practice in the Loop. It would be almost a decade before the Chicago Defender would chronicle Price's activity beyond the shadow of her husband's profession. The shift in narrative would begin the moment the Prices moved from Little Rock to Chicago. However, as early as 1918, change was afoot. Price's soon-to-be network of Black female mentors, advocates, sponsors, and collaborators was already in the making. About 2 months prior to Price's visit, Holt, who was also known as Lena James Douglas around this time, received her Master of Music degree from the Chicago Musical College. Holt's engagements with the classical music scene predated her academic honor. She regularly reviewed the operatic and orchestral programs of the Chicago Symphony Orchestra and reported on the classical recitals of Black artists, including a certain Mrs. Estella Bonds. Holt also delivered public lectures on music appreciation and was programmed in concert as both performer and composer. Her activity extended beyond newspaper columns and concert halls to her home here at 4405 South Prairie Avenue, located in Bronzeville, the heart of the Black metropolis. We don't know whether Price and her aunt visited Holt during her 1918 stay, but it is quite possible that Price may have come across Holt's open invitation in the Chicago Defender that read, "Mrs. Holt particularly offers the hand of fellowship to members of the art world." The following year, Holt co-founded NAM and became the most visible and influential woman in early NAM leadership. On the 12th of March, 1919, Holt hosted a meeting of musicians at her home and established a date for the first annual convention. The inaugural convention took place at the Wabash Avenue YMCA. In July 1920, NAM convened in New York City for its second annual meeting. Price was not in attendance, but she was listed in the minutes as a member from Arkansas. A few years later, in 1922, Holt withdrew from her position at NAM, citing personal reasons for her departure. Although Holt left Chicago a few years before Price's 1927 arrival, Holt's engagements across the multiple facets of Chicago's Black classical community as a composer, performer, lecturer, critic, founder, president, administrator, and more laid much of the groundwork for Price's eventual community. Holt's foundational work with NAM, along with the subsequent wave of African American female leadership, helped institutionalize Black women's activism in classical music. Through this work, further connections were consequently made possible as years passed. When Price moved to Chicago, these connections became tangible. Members listed in the 1920 NAM minutes, such as Estella C. Bonds of Illinois, were transformed from names on a page to connections in person. The hand of Black Women's Fellowship was readily found in the Bonds family home. It extended to artists across various backgrounds, disciplines, and generations. Theodore Charles Stone remembered Bonds' home as, to quote him directly, the only place where young Black students could meet major international celebrities such as Roland Hayes or Lillian Avanti. One could hardly think of music in Chicago without thinking of the Bonds family. This was also Margaret's recollection of her childhood. She said in her own words, "From my mother, a church organist, I had actual physical contact with all the living composers of African descent. My mother had a collector's nose for anything that was artistic, and, a true woman of God, she lived at the Sermon on the Mount. Her loaves and fish fed a multitude of pianists, singers, violinists, and composers. And those who were not in need of material food came for spiritual food. Under her wings, many a musician trusted, and she was my link with the Lord." Margaret was 14 at the time of Price's move and started as her student, learning the craft of composition and no doubt honing her piano skills under Price's expertise. Price was fully aware of the younger Bonds' performance abilities. In early February of 1929, a month before Margaret turned 16, Price composed Fantasie Nègre in E minor. She inscribed the work to my talented little friend, Margaret A. Bonds. The piece provided Margaret with an array of pianistic challenges and was a masterful example of how to render a Black vernacular in a classically virtuosic language. Inevitably, Margaret, much like her mother, became a close friend of Price. And thus, when Price's abusive marriage ended in divorce, financial woe, and no place to live, she knew that she could depend upon the wider family that formed her Chicago. Price's temporary living situation with the Bonds family proved conducive to her work as a composer. She wrote new pieces, extracted parts, and submitted scores with the support and assistance of an invested, tight-knit community. Margaret described scenes of late nights in winter at her family home, where a flurry of hands belonging to every brown-skinned musician in Chicago who could write a note would gather around the Bonds' large kitchen table amid piles of manuscript paper and help Florence meet her deadline. One important deadline for both Price and Margaret was on the 15th of July 1932. This was the submission deadline for the Rodman Wanamaker Music Contest. The Wanamaker Contests operated on a national scale. Founded in 1927 by philanthropist and store owner Rodman Wanamaker, the contests were born out of Wanamaker's sympathetic disposition toward African Americans and his desire to create a platform that exclusively elevated Black composers. The contests attracted a great number of submissions countrywide and strongly encouraged classical scores that engaged Black musical idioms. The 1932 contest was co-sponsored by NAMM and the African-American-led Robert Curtis Ogden Association of the Wanamaker Store. They invited submissions from 3 categories with prizes totaling $1,000. Around this time, Price broke her foot, and the recovery period reportedly gave her the resolve to finish her symphony in E minor. The order of events is not entirely clear. All we know is that Price's stay with the Bonds family, the completion of her Wanamaker submissions, and the sustaining of her injury were linked. However, it is telling that the story of Price's temporary residence with the Bonds family comes from Margaret, retrospectively, rather than from Price herself. Price was retiring by nature, and she may well have regarded her stay with the family as a personal matter, not to be publicly disclosed. Nevertheless, Margaret's account, 35 years after the fact, is of wide significance and helps historicize Price's compositional path. Her recollection reveals the hand of Black women's fellowship, working behind the scenes, entwining uplift and spirituality. It details Estella and Margaret joining Price in prayer and shows that Margaret perceived their prayers to be powerful because not only did she win the song category with her composition Sea Ghosts, but also Price won both the piano and symphonic categories with her sonata and symphony in E minor. Fantasie Nègre No. 4 and Ethiopia's Shadow in America received honorable mentions. From the spiritual fellowship of the Bonds to the musical fellowship of Black Chicago's best creative practitioners, Price's invitation into the Bonds family home both relieved her mind of material considerations and granted her the time and space to fully devote herself to composition. Price by this time was not a nascent composer. Decades of expertise informed her craft. But it was not until her individual expertise converged with the collective support of an uplifting community that Chicago's most celebrated Black female symphonist would emerge. The following year, the Chicago Symphony Orchestra performed Price's symphony in E minor. Nahum Daniel Brasher captured the event in his review for the Chicago Defender. But Brasher misrepresented the events slightly. The program was not all under the direction of the Chicago Friends of Music. Entirely passed over at the time was the fact that Maud Roberts George underwrote the Negro in Music concert at a cost of $250. Soon after the Negro in Music concert, George's commitment to uplifting Black practitioners, and especially women, would be documented in one of the most comprehensive historical records of Black women's activity in political, social, economic, and cultural arenas across the country. The National Association of Colored Women would publish the volume and title it Lifting as They Climb, in reference to their motto. In an essay called Women in Music, George would list the contributions of what she described as 20 outstanding artists of the world. Among such names as Marian Anderson, Lillian Evanti, Camille Nickerson, and Shirley Graham Du Bois, Price would be listed alongside references to her Wanamaker Prizes and her symphonic debut in the Century of Progress series. Elizabeth Lindsay Davis, chair of the National Association of Colored Women's History Committee, would reference the series in her foreword to the volume, saying, and I quote, "It is fitting at this time that the Negro woman should take her part in the Century of Progress and prove to the world that she, too, is finding her place in the sun." And indeed, through her part in the Century of Progress, Price began to find her place in the sun as one of the foremost African American symphonists of her time. But it was through Black women's activism, their nurturing and their networking, long before her Chicago arrival, that Price found herself in a position to embrace what lay beyond the horizon. As we draw to an end, I return to the theme of listening. In preparation for my album, Fantasie Nègre, the piano music of Florence Price, I went to the Price archives at the University of Arkansas, determined to locate Price's 4 complete fantasy works for solo piano. Up until that point, I had only studied Fantasie Nègre No. 1 in E minor, which is the one that you heard earlier, dedicated to Margaret Bonds. But in the case of Fantasie Nègre No. 3 in F minor, I anticipated scattered fragments as the work was thought to be incomplete. When I located the score, I could see that there was a first page and a second page, and that was it. Nothing more, simply silence. And so I listened closely. To find the rest of the music, I had to imagine what Price might say next. Judging by the other fantasies, I expected to find loose pages of music that returned to the original minor key, but there was nothing. I re-examined the manuscript and realized that Price had more to say in the key of A-flat major. I then looked for pages that continued in this key. I was then able to identify the missing half of the piece. Price's surviving papers gave me everything I needed to reconstruct and complete the third fantasy. I just needed to listen.
Thank you so much, Dr. Ege. That was just a pleasure and a joy. The music was beautiful. The playing was extraordinary. And your scholarship just draws on such a rich number of like primary sources to really like document and look at these opportunities. And I I was really struck in particular by, I mean, by a number of things, but like when you showed that photo, I think there were two of them of the National Association of Negro Musicians, because I'd read your work and you talk about how the leadership was predominantly female, but I was just really struck seeing those images, just how many women were part of that organization and part of the group, which was just something that like sort of reading about it hadn't processed, but like seeing the photos was just absolutely kind of incontrovertible. And thank you. I had several other things that I wanted to ask you, but there are some questions in the chat. So let me pass one of these on to you. So there was a question here about the lost music. So Sui Kun Kun says, I read that most of Nora Holt's music is lost. Is there any chance it might be found, or are there any archives or anything somewhere? Which seems like a particularly pertinent question given what happened in 2009 with a lot of Florence Price is presumed, which I mean it was at the time lost, but suddenly a whole lot of music was kind of just rediscovered.
So, by the way, thank you for all of the comments. It was really fun to see that and interact with you. With Nora Holt's music, the two pieces that we know about are pieces that she actually published herself in a journal that she founded herself called Music and Poetry. And those two pieces are Negro Dance, which you heard, and an art song called The Sandman. She wrote up to 200 pieces for orchestra and chamber ensemble and various songs. And we just don't know where they are. And it goes back to what I was saying about these scattered fragments. And we just have to try our best to listen and to look. Some places where you can access her works and information about her include Yale and the Center for Black Music Research and New York Public Library as well. So she's around in these different places. And I really hope that a trove turns up, because I can only imagine how amazing the rest of her catalog is.
Yeah, so at least 198 missing works. Let's like put the word out. Anyone that's like renovating their house should like pay particular attention. So there was another question, which was from one of our young pianists, Ronnie, and he asked whether you as a performer do anything different to prepare to play Price's work or these works with such a strong kind of element that comes from the spiritual tradition, as opposed to something that might be more strictly kind of purely Western or purely classical.
Yes, I do a lot of reading. I read the literature of Eileen Southern. I read a lot by Raylinda Brown and Helen Walker Hill. And I think as well with this repertoire, I have to trust myself as a pianist. And I'm lucky because there are many great pianists who have performed this work. One is in the chat. I saw William Chapman Nyaho. It's really great to see you there. And I have been listening to his recordings, and I've got his volume in my bookshelf back here of music by composers from the African continent and diaspora. And so looking for people who have done this work before me is a really helpful thing to do, because it gives me so much inspiration, and it fills me with a lot of confidence as well that I can also, interpret this music and in a way put my own stamp on it as a pianist.
I think we probably only have time for one more question. George Wilson has asked if we know very much about how the white male contemporary symphonists of Price's day responded to her music. Do we know anything about the reception by other musicians who were writing symphonic music?
Well, it's interesting because with the premiere, when you read the description by Nahum Daniel Brasher, George Gershwin is there. He's listening to her music. He's there in the box with John Alden Carpenter. And it's really interesting to read the reviews for that concert because it seems that perhaps for those of the white press, the significance, the historical significance of the event isn't fully grasped. And there's one critic in particular who is more interested in what's happening in the John Alden Carpenter box rather than what's going on stage as these Black performers are playing their music and really making history. And so it's kind of difficult to construct or reconstruct a narrative around the reception in the white press and with white male composers. John Alden Carpenter was definitely interested in Price's work, and there's correspondence between the two of them. But I think, again, going back to the themes of listening and looking, because of the silence in the white mainstream, that's why I'm very much inspired to look and listen to the Black women around Price and to see how they valued her work. And obviously, as we can see through this narrative, they wholeheartedly championed her.
Thank you so much, Dr. Ege, and thank you everybody for coming. There is another event tomorrow that's part of our Women's History Month here, a panel session with women alumni. I don't know the Latin declension of that word very well. That is happening tomorrow at 5 o'clock. Thank you again, Dr. Ege, and everybody have a wonderful afternoon.
Thank you, everyone.